What's up guys, welcome back to another video in the Learn Linux series, and today we're going to be talking about virtual machine, and we're going to be installing the virtual machine that we need to use in order to get through this course. So what is a virtual machine? So a virtual machine is just that, what the name says. It is a virtual computer, a software abstraction of computer hardware. So we take all the components of a computer, let's say the CPU, the RAM, the storage, networking, audio, graphics, whatever it is, and we make a virtual version of that. And what that allows us is to maximize our hardware. So we can, instead of having just our own main operating system, for example, Windows 10 or Linux or whatever it is, we can now have multiple versions at the same time. So we can have Windows 10 and Windows 7 and Linux all running on the same machine at the exact same time. So there's no wasted performance from our hardware. And that's great for several amounts of reasons. It's very useful in the business world, very useful for also isolation, so you have a separate system, and a bunch of other reasons which we won't get into. So these virtual machines are managed by something called a hypervisor. It literally just creates and runs virtual machines and manages those resources that we talked about. So it's going to manage the CPU, the RAM usage, the networking, all those kinds of things. And it can sometimes be referred to as a virtual machine monitor or virtual machine manager, or however, and it's usually shortened to VMM. And sometimes it can be backed by hardware using Intel VT or AMD SVM technology. Intel VT and AMD SVM were technologies developed by Intel and AMD respectively in order to help the hypervisor have special instructions to execute these virtual machines operations and instructions quicker. And it helps for things to work smoother and faster. And that's about the extent that I'm going to talk about it. You can Google it and read a little bit more about it, but it might be too advanced depending on your level of computer science knowledge. Now, there's two different types of hypervisors. There is a Type 1 and a Type 2 hypervisor. Type 1 runs directly on the hardware with its own minimal operating system. So instead of having Windows 10 and then installing the hypervisor on top of it, you just install the hypervisor, and the hypervisor is its own operating system. And generally, this is going to provide better performance. It's generally an operating system optimized for the use of being a hypervisor. It's going to use less resources in general, allowing for more resources for the virtual machines and a bunch of other things. It's also the thing that you will see more so in the real world. So in the business world, you go to a big enterprise, you generally see some form of Type 1 hypervisor, unless they're using some kind of cloud technology or something like that, but that's different. And there's also Type 2, which is normally what we would use at home, and it's something that we can run directly on top of our operating system. So install on our Windows 10, our Linux, whatever it is. And we can also use it in the business if we want to just, like, for example, say, give a developer access to have a virtual machine for testing a specific software. That can be useful for that kind of scenario. But for the most part, you'll be using Type 2 at home. And here's some examples of Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors. We've got VMware ESXi, Hyper-V, KVM, Proxmox, and Citrix Xen Server as Type 1s. And the two most common, there's probably more, but these are the two that I'm really aware of that I've used before. There's VMware Workstation and VirtualBox. Those are Type 2s. So Hyper-V is built into Windows. Usually you need a Pro license for that. VMware Workstation is paid, but there is a free version called VMware Workstation Player. And VirtualBox is completely free. For the most part, also on the Type 1 hypervisors, KVM and Proxmox are also free. But for our scenario, we're going to be using VirtualBox. It's once again free, and it's easy to set up, and there's plenty of resources out there for you to use, and will give you the least amount of headache. Now, I wanted to bring up the concept that virtualization is not emulation. So what do we mean by that? So processors run on what are called instruction set architectures. So essentially, processors have a standardized language and method of interaction from software to hardware. So for example, we have the x86 and x86-64 instruction sets, which are 32 bits and 64 bits respectively. And you don't really have to care too much about what that means. Essentially, it's how much memory can be addressed at once. But x86 and x86-64 is normally what you will see on your home computers. If you buy a standard Intel or AMD CPU, for the most part, you'll have an x86-64 CPU. x86 used to be very common, but nobody really sells those anymore. It's kind of an outdated thing at this point. ARM and ARM 64, those are more things that you'll see on your cell phones, so Android phones, iPhones. If you've seen the new M1 Max, those will run on an ARM architecture. And so all this to say that ARM and x86 are two different instruction sets. So what that means is if I have ARM instructions from an ARM virtual machine, for example, the x86 CPU is not going to be able to understand that. So in order to do that, we have to do something called emulation, which you might have heard of if you've ever tried to, for example, play NES games on your computer. There's something called emulation. That is not to be confused with a virtual machine. A virtual machine will pass the instructions through to the CPU, versus with an emulator, you're translating those instructions so that the CPU underneath can then understand it. Now, of course, if you want to learn more, if you need more information, here are two links. You can also just Google in general more information on the instruction set architecture, for example, learn more about that. In general, operating systems books online you can find. Those will help you understand more of these concepts, but this is the extent to which we're going to cover it today. Now, to determine if our CPU has support for AMD SVM or Intel VTX, we can go ahead and Google our CPU model, which you can find by going into Windows and Task Manager and clicking the Performance tab. You can just Google that name for the model number, and you'll probably get a link such as this one to, for example, the Intel website or the AMD website. And you can look at the specs, and you can scroll down or Control F and say virtualization. You'll see here Intel virtualization technology VT-X, yes. So we have support for this on this specific CPU. My CPU is an AMD 3700X. I happen to know that it has SVM support. I have it enabled. So next I will show you how to enable it on your computer. Generally, you will have to go into the BIOS and flip a certain switch, and then you'll be fine to use it. But if you do not do this, you will have problems later on when you try to run VirtualBox. Understand that you need to have support for VTX, and you need to do this step to avoid problems later.